I'm super excited to have a returning guest, Cynthia Thurlow. She was on the podcast a few months ago, and we talked all about intermittent fasting for women and her book, The Intermittent Fasting Transformation. So I'm super excited she's back here today. I could talk to Cynthia forever and ever. She's just so full of knowledge. She has her own podcast along with another podcast that she's on. Cynthia, what's the name of the other podcast that you are on? That you
The
host?
Intermittent Fasting Podcast with Melanie Avalon.
Yep. That's right. That's a hard name. Anyway, so that podcast, and of course she's on several others. So Cynthia, thank you again and welcome back.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I've been looking forward to having this conversation again.
Well, I just was listening again to the second time to your podcast with Drew Pruitt, who I love. Drew Pruitt. I've followed him forever too. You and him, y'all are my two podcasts, my two go-to podcasts for sure. And to have the two of you together, it was such a great podcast. So I want everybody to make sure they go listen to that podcast because it is filled with so much great information. I think it was almost 2 hours. Isn't that right?
It was a long podcast. And it's sometimes, I aim to keep the podcast like ideally when I'm on someone's podcast, it's as long as they want to record. But yeah, sometimes you get some long ones. And it's amazing that when you have this flexibility to be able to ask all the questions and allow people to formulate their answers in different ways, it's really helpful.
Yeah, well, I thought it was really good. So I did want to reference that. But so we talked in our first podcast all about intermittent fasting and perimenopause and menopause. But I still got more questions that I'd like to address with you. But first, one of the things I wanted to ask you is what are some of the biggest mistakes you see women making with intermittent fasting?
Oh goodness, this is a treasure trove answer and response.
I know it's going to be a lot.
Yeah. So I think from a very basic level, I see women that want intermittent fasting to be the thing that is going to fix all the problems. And it's one very beneficial form of hormesis or hormetic stress. But I always remind women not to put all their eggs in one basket, that, you can't just fast and then think you can eat a hyperpalatable, highly processed diet, have terrible sleep and overexercise, etc. So I think that's probably number one, is just the right mindset around intermittent fasting. Number two, I see a lot of women that don't sleep well and they're overexercising and their stress is out of control and they don't understand that it's almost like adding gasoline to a fire, adding in fasting. So I always say, if you're not sleeping well, you got to fix that first. And so many women aren't happy when I say that, but I always say, if you're sleeping well, then your body is optimized to be able to intermittent fast. I would say some of the other common mistakes I see people making, people that are not eating enough protein. So they're doing one meal a day and they think they can sustain that. And you and I both know how critically important protein is, especially for muscle protein synthesis as we are heading into perimenopause and menopause. And we start losing muscle mass with age. That's a given. That's whether you want to be that to be your reality or not. And then I would also say women that don't fast for their cycle. So if they're still getting a menstrual cycle and they think they can fast doing OMAD 31 days out of the month, and then they're wondering why their cravings are out of control and they have no energy and they're crashing. And so understanding that if you're in peak fertile years, 35 and under, or you're in perimenopause, 10 to 15 years before menopause, you really do have to fast for your cycle. And so I think those are the typical, most common things I see women doing. In fact, women want to argue about this with myself and my team on social media. And I always say to my team, we're not arguing about this. Like we're in the research. We know what it says. I'm not going to argue about this. If they don't want the recommendation and the suggestion based on clinical experience and research, that's okay. They're not our people. So
that's exactly right. Oh my goodness. I can't imagine somebody arguing about it. It's just so funny to me.
Oh, it's unbelievable.
Okay. So here's another question I get a lot is what breaks a fast? And I know in your book, you talk about a clean fast, but some of these programs out there are saying, well, as long as it's 50 calories, talk to me a little bit about that.
I probably know which program you're talking about. So if you're eating food, you're breaking your fast, right? We recognize that if we're looking at macros, protein, fat, and carbohydrates, fat's going to have the most negligible impact on blood sugar. Then fat then protein, then carbohydrates. And so, if you look at the research, could you get by with a teaspoon of MCT oil? Yeah, probably. That probably wouldn't break your fast. But if you're having butter, which is insulinemic, it will. If you're having cream, it's going to break your fast. If you're having fatty coffees, that's technically going to break your fast. And I think a lot of it's dependent on what type of fasting you're trying to do. Are you really insulin resistant and obese and overweight? Then I would recommend you clean fast. If you are someone that's at goal weight and you're metabolically flexible, you can probably get away with some butter in your coffee, or, having a piece of cheese in a fasted state without too much detriment. But I do think a lot of it is really dependent on, who you're following, what they're stating. I see a lot of people who think they can eat 50 calories of grapes. I'm like, no, you're definitely broken your fast. Eating food is breaking your fast, people. And what I would suggest is break your fast. If you're that hungry, break your fast. But if you're trying to do a clean fast, or you're trying to avoid evoking an insulin response, then, you can probably get away with a little bit of MCT oil in coffee or tea, and that won't break your fast, but most other things will. And unfortunately, there are a lot of people who are always trying to come up with strategies to rook the system to their advantage. They don't really want to clean fast. So what do they try to do? They try to say, oh, you can have 50 calories and that's fine. Well, your body's smarter than that. I mean, you are having a cephalic phase insulin response when you're consuming said calories. And so it's important to understand, why are you fasting? What are your goals? And if you are, as I stated earlier, if you are obese, overweight, insulin resistant, then I would really encourage you to lean into a clean fast. And if you need to break your fast earlier, there's no shame in that. There's no one that's going to come out, the fasting police, that they're going to come after you and tell you you're not doing it right. I just think that we have to get out of this kind of narrow-minded, dogmatic focus where it's all good or all bad. It's like, okay, there's some nuance, but what are your goals? Where are you in your menstrual cycle? Do you have terrible sleep and your stress is out of control? Well, maybe you need to not fast right now. That might actually be mitigating a lot of the behaviors that you're seeing, is that you're over fasting, you're not getting enough, restorative sleep, over exercising. In fact, I'm starting to see a triad of women, not of any particular age group, but they over fast, they over restrict their food, and they over exercise. And so that's kind of a dangerous position to be in. But back to your original intent of your question, food breaks your fast, generally speaking. And certainly a lot of these fatty coffees that are 300 or 400 calories are most definitely going to break your fast.
Right. And I even see people putting collagen in their coffee, saying that's not going to break their fast. And
it's
then
protein that will break your fast.
Yep. Then they're surprised when it does. And so just to be transparent, I mean, for years, and I guess even now, you would say that I definitely do a 12-hour fast. I'd like to say I would do a longer fast, but I cannot drink my coffee just black. I cannot. I have to put a little half and half in it. And I think I am, well, I know I am metabolically flexible. So it doesn't seem to bother me, but I have tried just black coffee. It just isn't going to happen for me.
Have you ever tried adding like cinnamon to it, or like Redmond's salt?
No. I have tried cinnamon, but not the Redmond salt. Is that what you said?
Yeah, so it's a high quality salt made in the United States, and it'll change the flavor profile just enough, because what people in the United States in particular are just really, their palates are very sugar acclimated, and that's why they don't like bitter. But bitter is good. I mean, when you have bitter tea, bitter coffee, the polyphenols in that will upregulate fat oxidation, lipolysis. And so I remind people, like, don't be afraid of bitter. Like, bitter is not a bad thing. I actually brew green tea. I let it cool. I ice it, and that's how I drink it. But I've gotten acclimated to how bitter it is, and I've never been a coffee drinker. But things like cinnamon that you add to black coffee will actually increase insulin sensitivity. It also changes the flavor profile. Same thing with sea salt, high quality salt.
Okay, I'll try it that way. Maybe I'll just go to green tea, because I'm like, oh, but anyway.
Or just have it in your feeding window. I mean, that's the other thing. If you love
true.
it that much, have it in your feeding window and enjoy it.
Right. Okay. So, and then the athletic greens that everybody's using, that breaks your fast too, right?
Yes, I would have that in your feeding window. When I have mine a couple days a week, I have it like usually either to break my fast with, or I just kind of sip on it during my feeding window. And that works really well. Like, obviously athletic greens is a high quality product, but it's like food in your water. So
right. And then what about longer fast, like a 24-hour fast occasionally, not all the time, but occasionally. What are your thoughts on those?
I think it depends on the individual. There's a law of diminishing returns. So if you're already metabolically flexible, fairly thin, there's a law of diminishing return for these really long fasts. So when you get over 24, 36, 48 hours, and so after being in the hospital for 13 days in 2019, I don't do long fasts because I choose not to. But if someone's weight loss resistant, someone's insulin resistant, they're trying to work through a plateau, sometimes those longer fasts can be very beneficial. And so I think it really depends on what your goals are. We know 24 hours, you're really ramping up autophagy, which is this waste and recycling process in the body. You're going to feel very differently at 24 hours. It is very much a psychological fast, more so than a physiological one, because people are like, I'm ready to eat. I want to eat. I'm ready to eat. But understanding that there's a lot of things that go on behind the scenes. And so I think getting very clear about what your goals are and why you're doing a longer fast is important. I personally just don't do long fasts because I don't need to, but it's also because when you really look at the research, I don't want to lose muscle mass. And that is something that's very much a fine edge, kind of like a huge area of focus for me is not losing muscle mass and really teaching middle-aged women that you don't want to lose muscle mass. So people that are always doing these really long fasts, I want to do a 7-day fast. I always say, why?
Yeah, that sounds
Why do you
awful.
want to do that? And I think it's, again, the law of diminishing returns. It's looking at Ted Naiman, who's a physician in the health space. I mean, he was talking about that he doesn't see the benefit for lean, thin people to do really long fasts. And I would have to agree with that. But if you are insulin resistant, you are diabetic, in conjunction with your healthcare practitioner, if you've decided that you're ready to do those kinds of fasts, I think they can be very therapeutic.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I'm not into I've done some 24-hour fasts before, and I think just like you said, it is very mental. And then unfortunately, I was just like didn't plan ahead. And I just wanted everything to eat, and I felt like I ate a
Yeah.
ton after that 24
Yeah.
hours, so I didn't feel so great after that, I don't think.
I
Oh,
bet.
yeah, no. If you plan ahead, I think after, once you do the 24-hour fast and you're like, "I'm gonna break my fast with this," it's much better, but I think mentally it was just not good for me. Okay, so we've talked about metabolically being flexible. And you kind of told everybody on the first podcast, but will you refresh everybody's memory what metabolic flexibility is? And I can't remember if you've said it's 12% or maybe it's gone even less than that, that people are metabolically flexible.
Yeah, I mean, so it's interesting. In 2018, the UNC School of Chapel Hill, School of Public Health actually did a study. And at that point, it was 12% of the population was metabolically flexible. Well, 2.5 years later, in the midst of climbing out of this pandemic, it's less than that. It's now 7 to 8% of the population is metabolically inflexible. So if you're watching this, you may be part of the small percentage that are still flexible, which there are not a lot of us. When we're talking about metabolic flexibility, we're really talking about our body being able to tap into stored fat or stored sugar as a fuel source. And we want to be able to use either. We don't want to be stuck in a mode where our body can only recognize and utilize stored glucose as a fuel source. And so ways to kind of understand if you are metabolically flexible, you're not going to have high blood pressure. Your triglycerides ideally should be less than 100. Your HDL, if you're a female, should be greater than 55. Your waist circumference should be under 35 inches, which is actually quite big. You should also have a fasting insulin between 2 to 5 milligrams per deciliter. Your fasting glucose should really be ideally 75 to 90. Obviously, metabolic syndrome is not defined based on values with fasting insulin, but I always include that because that's typically the first biomarker that will dysregulate. And it's important for everyone that's watching to understand you should be asking your healthcare practitioner for a fasting insulin. If they don't know how to interpret it, you want it between 2 to 5. And if you're metabolically flexible, that's where those numbers should be. We know when you're metabolically flexible, you can go in between meals without getting hungry. You're not getting hangry. You're able to lose weight fairly easily. You have plenty of energy throughout the day. Whereas people that are primarily using glucose, they get hungry an hour or two after eating. They get hangry, where they're kind of like a toddler, but in an adult size form, where they can't regulate their behavior because their blood sugar drops and they're typically not particularly pleasant to be around. I have a teenager right now that we're having to work on this with him. I'm like, how is it possible that I have a kid that's got some blood sugar issues? but he doesn't eat the way he should when he's at school, which is a whole separate conversation.
Mm-hmm.
But we also know people that are not metabolically flexible. They're going to struggle to lose weight. So if you're that woman that, says, I haven't been able to get rid of 5 pounds over the past 5 years, well, guess what? You probably are not able to effectively utilize stored fat as a fuel source. So those are some kind of high level ways of thinking about using both carbohydrates and fats as a fuel source. And even if you're thin, you have plenty of stored fat to be able to use. And what's unfortunately happened is over the last 50, 60 years, we've been encouraging our patients to eat snacks and mini meals, and that has really contributed to this lack of metabolic flexibility and why people don't even know what real hunger feels like anymore, because they just are like robots. They get up in the morning, they have their, highly processed, hyper palatable carbohydrate laden breakfast, and then they have, a fatty coffee or a candy bar in between breakfast and lunch, and then their lunch is a big sandwich, and then they're eating a big bowl of pasta on Monday, for dinner, and it starts this whole vicious cycle. So a lot of the work that I do, and I'm sure you're doing this with your ladies as well, is helping people understand how our meal frequency and our meal choices really play a large role in this.
Yeah, it's so funny because when I first learned about intermittent fasting, well, first of all, I used to be one of those people that was not anywhere close to being metabolically flexible when I was younger, because all I could think about was food. And when I would carry food with me. I do carry food with me now, but it's for different reasons, so that if I really need something to eat, I've got something healthy to eat. But I would get that hangry where I was miserable. I couldn't even talk to you. Just get me something to eat. So, and I ate tons of carbs back then too. This was in my 20s and 30s, and I could get away with it then. As I got into my 40s, obviously I couldn't. One of the things too, when I started intermittent fasting, I thought, well, okay, if I was going to do a 16-8 protocol, so 16 hours of fasting and 8 hours of eating, then I could graze in that 8 hours. I could eat whatever. But I've learned from you and others that that's not what we should be doing. We should be eating our meals and going for a period 4 to 5 hours in between our meals, correct?
Absolutely. So, I remind people that our bodies are better acclimated to have a bolus of food and then 4 to 5 hours in between, or at least 4 hours in between, because there's all these things that go on in our digestive system. The migrating motor complex is one, and it doesn't work well or efficiently when we're constantly eating or grazing, as you mentioned. So a bolus of food with 40 to 50 grams of protein at meal number 1, a bolus of food 4 to 5 hours later is bolus number 2. I know bolus sounds very impersonal, but just for purposes of this conversation, 40 to 50 grams then of protein, and then adding in non-starchy carbs and healthy fats, depending on what your protein is. But yeah, that's a very common misconception. And I remind people that every time we're eating, depending on what we're eating, we're secreting insulin. And I remind people insulin's not a bad hormone. But if we're constantly eating and our blood sugar never comes back to some degree of normalization and we continue to eat, that insulin stays high. And guess what happens? High insulin means you can't tap into fat stores for energy. So I think for a lot of people, it's that understanding that we want to have a small secretion of insulin in response to a blood sugar increase. And then your insulin levels come back down. You go a couple more hours without eating, then it goes up, a little blip, comes back down. I think it's important to understand that insulin's not all bad, but it's gotten a very bad rap, largely related to, dietary choices and meal frequency.
Right. And so there's a lot to be said about managing our insulin levels, right? By wearing a CGM. I know you wear a CGM sometimes. I've worn them in the past. I got a little fixated on it. So now, and I've heard you say that you like gadgets. I love gadgets, but sometimes I can become a little too fixated on it. And so I have to be careful with stuff like that. But, this walking after you eat can help tremendously, right? What do you think about the food order?
I know so Glucose Revolution is a book that I encourage everyone to read. I have no vested interest in Jessie Ashape's work. I think she just has done a really nice job breaking things down. It hasn't changed the way I eat my food because I tend to eat a pretty protein heavy meal. I do think it's helpful for some people, especially people who have maybe been fearful of eating carbohydrates over the last several years. But I kind of feel like the big message is Jessie's a very healthy metabolically flexible person, I don't ever want people to take all those tricks and use it as an excuse to eat like a jerk, right? And I'm being nice when I say that. So food order, yes, obviously if you have something in your body to help buffer a carbohydrate load, I think that can be helpful. It's why, starting your meal with bread is probably like the worst decision you can do. But if you're metabolically healthy, if you do that occasionally, that shouldn't it shouldn't mitigate a blood sugar response fairly significantly. I always say if you focus on protein, that's going to help slow absorption of whatever you're consuming. Same thing with healthy fats. But, I do find that gadgets can be very beneficial. I do think that whether it's an Oura Ring, a Whoop Band, an Apollo Neuro, any of these devices and even the CGMs can be helpful. But there are some people out there that find data makes them stressed versus I love data because I'm a nerd and I like numbers. But I think for other people, like I've had patients who just said, I can't monitor all these things. It stresses me out. And I was like, okay, that's fine. Better to know that about yourself and kind of say, okay, this is an area that I don't want to, be constantly scanning my CGM or constantly looking at my Oura Ring data. But I think it really depends on the individual. But I do think those metrics can be very helpful. And I would say that if but nothing else, having a glucometer to monitor your blood sugar response to meals, very helpful to monitor. As Marty Kendall says, your trigger point, what's your blood sugar when you get hungry and what's your blood sugar response to a meal. I think that is very valuable information. So I would say at a minimum, maybe having a glucometer around can be hugely impactful.
Yeah. And I did like wearing the CGM, just not, I wouldn't want to do it all the time.
Continuously.
I've done it for 2 weeks at a time and I learned a lot. And so it was very helpful for me to learn when my problem is I don't do so well because I do like sugar still. I heard you say you're not a sugar person. I like sugar. Unfortunately, I try to stay away from it, but there are times when I just can't. And then when I'd see that thing spike way up high, I'd be like, oh gosh. So my Oura Ring.
Yeah. I like dark chocolate.
Uh-huh.
Sorry, no, I was gonna say I like dark chocolate. And so my way of enjoying dark chocolate is I have stevia sweetened dark chocolate, and then I can enjoy the portion that I have. And there's a nearly non-existent blood sugar response. So that's how I kind of get around it. But I think that if there's anything that's your kryptonite at home or something you really struggle to avoid eating, just don't have it at home or just enjoy it occasionally. I think that's the way to mitigate that. What's interesting is when I wore CGMs off and on for like 18 months. What I found was that plantains, which I love, do not love me. It didn't matter how I ate them. It would spike my blood sugar. I could eat a banana. I could eat a mango. I could eat a pineapple. Not that I eat those things often. Not the same effect as a plantain. So go figure. But I think it can be very helpful to let us know, like, what's the net impact of our choices, sleep, stress, etc.
Right. Yeah. And I totally agree. And I try not to have any of that stuff around. If it were just me living by myself, I'd be fine. But my husband's, he loves it. And his family owns cookie companies. So
how funny. Oh, that's dangerous.
So he brings home cookies to me because he thinks he's doing me a favor. And I've tried to explain to him, that's not my love language. Don't bring cookies home to me, please.
No, it's like my kryptonite. Please don't.
So anyway, so you've kind of touched on this, but if someone who can't lose weight, they're exercising, they feel like they're eating a whole food diet, but they still can't lose weight. You look at sleep, right?
Yeah, I was saying sleep.
Yeah. And I've heard you talk about this, that sleep is like one of your big things, like don't get in the way of your sleep. See, I'm the same way. And that's why I love my Oura Ring. That's exactly why I got the Oura Ring. So sleep is huge.
Sleep is huge. And I think for a lot of people, they think they can get by with 5 or 6 hours of sleep. And if you look at the research, 6 hours of sleep or less a night, you're not going to be able to maintain a healthy blood sugar. You're going to impact your leptin and ghrelin, which are your hunger and satiety hormones. You're going to impact your fasting insulin, your cortisol. You don't crave good food when you're sleep deprived. So I would say sleep is foundational. I think stress. Let's be honest. The last 2.5 years, there's no woman watching or listening that hasn't had more stress in their personal or professional lives given the pandemic. And then I think about how many women are still in this mode of they want to be cardio bunnies. They don't want to lift weights. They're worried about bulking up. It's physiologically impossible for that to happen. Where they're still eating the crappy diet they ate when they were a teenager or in college. And I remind them, I'm like, part of figuring out what works for you in middle age is sometimes an elimination of things that you like. And it could start with gluten, it could start with dairy, it could start with alcohol. And that's a big bear. There are a lot of people, a lot of women in particular, that really overconsume alcohol. And if you're looking at the research and the health benefits are just not there. You're not going to get a ton of resveratrol from drinking red wine. It would be impossible to drink a lot. We know it's very brain toxic. It impairs estrogen detoxification in the body. We know it can be an independent risk factor for developing breast cancer. And so I don't ever judge, and this isn't pejorative. I just think for a lot of women, their lifestyle is not aligned with trying to lose weight, and they don't want to change their lifestyle. The other thing is really working with an integrative or functional medicine provider. So looking at the Dutch, looking at the GI map, looking at gut health, looking at toxins in your environment. I know we both share an appreciation for Beauty Counter, and really getting clear about things you're exposed to in your food, your personal care products, and your environment that can impact your body's ability to lose weight. And I always remind people that you get healthy to lose weight. So if you're not healthy, you're not going to lose weight. But I think that those are like some of those common things I see with weight loss resistance. And obviously it's frustrating. I totally get it, but there's something you haven't yet figured out that is contributing to your weight loss resistance. I like to tell people, dairy, the 5-pound dairy, I don't eat dairy anymore. I've been gluten-free for 11 years. I've been dairy-free for 5. And dairy for me, even though I wasn't consuming it very often, was the missing link of why I had 5 pounds of fluff in perimenopause. And when you're 5'3", 5 pounds makes a difference. And
Oh, I
so for
know.
me,
I think I'm like 5'2.5" now. I'm shrinking, so
yeah. Yeah. So I tell people, I'm like, listen, dairy for a lot of women is highly inflammatory. So really looking at your food choices and getting honest with yourself. And so I always say jokingly, my last spice that's left is dark chocolate, which is why I'm so, careful and conscientious. I'm like, I have a little bit of dark chocolate every day, but that's my one vice. Like I don't drink alcohol. I don't have dairy, grains, gluten, none of those things, because they just weren't agreeing with my body anymore. And I don't see it from a place of lack. I see it from a place of empowerment. And I think that reframe is really important. If you really want to lose the weight, you have to literally leave no stone unturned to see what might be contributing to it. And for a lot of women, they've got hypothyroidism. They don't even realize their thyroid's, in a level that it's going to make it very challenging. As you're losing progesterone and estrogen and testosterone, it can impact all your other hormones. And so I remind people that you have to work with someone that's going to be willing to do the extra effort to figure out why you are weight loss resistant.
Yeah, because I think, we're so different. And so what works for one person may not work for another. So I think that that is really, and like you said, just uncovering it all. I felt I was under some major stress this summer and did a cortisol test, a saliva test. And my cortisol, it's supposed to be high in the morning. Mine was kind of flat. So we're working on that. So yeah, there's just so many things that can happen. And as we get older, we think we're supposed to have less stress, and somehow we have more stress, I think.
Well, I think it's also, we set ourselves up. There's something called andropause. So our adrenals go through menopause, just like our bodies go through menopause, and we're not as stress resilient. This is not contrived. This is not, designed to pat us on the back. We are not hormonally optimized to handle stress the way we did in our 20s and 30s. And so someone goes through a divorce, there's a death in the family, they have a big move, they have a job loss. I mean, some major catastrophic event happens and you realize you are not as stress resilient. And there's lots of ways to work around that, but there's also ways that we have to recognize we have to live our lives differently in middle age than we did when we were younger.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest thing. I think that this age can be the best, but we have to take more control. Things that we used to do, we may not be able to do anymore, but whether it be alcohol or too much cardio, all of that, those things. I think that's a lot to think about, and really prioritize that sleep. I'm going to go back to sleep because sleep is so important to me too. And I know it's important to you. So do you have like a sleep routine? Because I coach my clients too to come up with some sort of sleep routine to get them to sleep better, because it can be a problem as we get older too.
Well, and I think there are so many people that they forget that when their kids were toddlers and babies, we had sleep routines for them. And you have to navigate sleep routines for yourself too. You can't go from like sitting in front of the TV for 3 hours mindlessly watching TV, and your melatonin's been suppressed, your cortisol's up, your brain's like, okay, I'm not meant to be going to sleep even though it's dark outside. Really having, and it could be different for everyone, but there's specific things I do at night. Now, obviously it's dark at 5 o'clock.
Exactly.
My blue blockers go on if I'm in front of a screen, whether it's my iPad, my laptop, my computer, my phone. So there's definitely that. I start gearing myself up for bed. There's certain supplements I take about an hour before I'm thinking about going upstairs. Now that it's cold outside, I mean, it was like 19 degrees where I am this morning. So it's definitely getting colder. I will probably take a magnesium soak a couple times a week in winter or fall. I don't do it in the summer for obvious reasons. I don't like being like super hot before I go to bed. But, just getting deliberate about certain types of supplements, things that you do. My husband and I always walk our dogs before we head upstairs to bed. And so, I'm outside in the cold. I've gotten my temperature and, helped with metabolic flexibility because you're walking, you're helping with insulin sensitivity. Those muscles are using up whatever stored glucose is still circulating from dinner. For me, I don't eat within 3 hours before bed. So if I'm going to bed at 9, I'm done by 6 o'clock. I mean, occasionally, yes, I will eat a little later than I like to. But one thing about the pandemic, I realized my body actually does better if I close my feeding window when it's still light outside. So as an example, when this podcast is over, I'm going straight into my kitchen and I'm eating my dinner because that's kind of the way that I honor my body during the week. And because I've got kids going in 20 different directions, we eat together as a family on the weekend and not always every night during the week. Other things that I think about is, obviously supplementation. I have something called the Somnox, which was gifted to me. So I'll be fully transparent. You actually hug it when you're in bed, but it acclimates to your breathing. And it's really designed to kind of deepen your REM and your REM sleep, your deep sleep. And I've started using that sometimes when I'm in bed for the first 30 minutes and it shuts off. I have a PMF mat, which is probably my favorite thing that I'll do before bedtime. I have to be careful because I get so relaxed on it. Sometimes I'll fall asleep and that makes it hard for me to get into bed. But there's lots of different things. And like I said, I'm a hacker. Like I like to use gadgets. I acknowledge that might not be other people's choices, but I would say, limiting when you eat before bed, taking a walk before bed, getting into some magnesium. If you just soak your feet can be very helpful because most of us have lowered or non-optimized amounts of magnesium. We lose magnesium during stress. We have magnesium depleted soil. So I don't care if you eat all organic, you are not getting enough magnesium in your life. And so magnesium is something that I'm very deliberate about. And I'm always trying different combinations of supplements to find what works, what doesn't work. I've got it down to a pretty good regimen now with not a lot of things, but I do find that, also being cognizant of what are you processing before you go to bed. Like I may not be reading a physical book. I may be watching something on my iPad, but I don't per se watch stressful things or scary things or things that don't bring me joy. So if I'm going to watch something on my tablet, it's going to be something happy. And I think that's important. I think sometimes people like get on social media, they start scrolling, they get upset about something. And before they know it, they're awake for 2 hours when they should have gone to bed. So those are definitely some of the more high level things that I think about when I'm talking to clients or talking to other podcast hosts about things that I think are certainly an important starting point for most people. Oh, the other thing is cold, dark room. We keep our thermostat pretty cold in the winter and everyone's acclimated to it and they love it, but it's like on 63 at night so that everyone is under covers. It's cold. Everyone sleeps so much better.
Oh, so I do that, but my husband, I freeze him out. So we fight over this so much. We have an electric blanket and he turns his side on. I never have mine on. So it's so funny. I even have one of those chill pads. So
I had that, but it made too much noise. Like the Ooler, we had an Ooler and they sent it to me and I used it once and my husband and I were like, it makes too much noise.
See, I need noise too, because I have 2 dogs in the bed with me, which is a no, I know, but it's just something that's always been. And so and they snore, my dogs snore.
Oh,
so
funny.
I have to have, in fact, I have the hatch that's right beside my bed and I turn that thing up as loud as I can. So I'd rather hear that noise rather than snoring. And so but I have really worked hard at my sleep. sleep, because for so long I did not have good sleep, and I still wake up in the middle of the night, but I can go right back to sleep. I just shut my eyes and I will. I used to be so anxious, like, oh no, I'm not gonna go back to sleep. But then I read something somewhere that it said that even if you don't go back to sleep, if you just shut your eyes, it's almost as good. And I don't know if that's true or not, Cynthia, but I believed it. And so guess what? I just shut my eyes and I end up falling back asleep. I think
Yeah.
with that anxiety was going on, I would be like, "Oh, I'm not going to go to sleep, and now I'm going to end up with dementia." And now, you know how we can go down a rabbit hole.
Yeah.
But okay, so let's talk about supplements. First of all, magnesium. Is there a certain magnesium you like?
Yes. Magnesium L-threonate, and that will be one of the supplements I am creating. I want to have a magnesium L-threonate powder that you would take before bed, because I found that to be the most efficacious. Magnesium L-threonate is important because it crosses the blood-brain barrier. And so this is why it's important to take at nighttime. I do take other forms of magnesium during the day. And because I don't have issues with constipation, I don't have to take magnesium glycinate or any of those varieties. I just take a chelated magnesium, but I would say magnesium L-threonate is super helpful.
Okay. And then talking about you creating supplements, you just created a creatine supplement. Now, I've just started hearing about this, and so I know nothing. I don't even know the right questions to ask you about creatine, so you're going to have to educate us. I
Yeah, no,
listened
I'd
to a
love
little
to.
bit of your podcast about it, but I don't know enough about it.
Yeah, no, I think creatine is probably, it's one of the most studied and researched supplements that's out there. So there's no question in terms of safety and efficacy. But we know based on research, it's particularly helpful for two things. Number one, muscle health, and which I'm a huge proponent of, because sarcopenia is not a question of if but when we will lose muscle mass. And if we lose muscle mass, we lose insulin sensitivity. So do you understand why that's so important to me?
Mm-hmm.
Number two, we know it's really critically important for brain and cognition. And so one of the greatest concerns I hear from, middle-aged women is, I want to maintain insulin sensitivity because I don't want to end up having any issues with dementia or any neurocognitive disorders. And so there's a lot of really good research on the benefits, in particular with perimenopausal and menopausal females, because women have 70 to 80% less stored creatine in their bodies. So we're already at a disadvantage. There's a lot of good research about women at peak fertile years as well, but there's not enough emphasis on this. And really what creatine does is it helps with ATP production. ATP production is energy production in the mitochondria, so in our cells. And, this is where it's really important to understand that supplementing it is key, because you can't get enough exogenous sources, meaning even if you eat a carnivorous diet, you are not going to be able to eat enough meat to be able to replenish what your body loses day to day. And if you're actually vegetarian or vegan, you need more. And that's what's interesting. So 3 grams a day for women, 5 for men and vegetarians and vegans. And you can't get enough in your diet. So, people will say, oh, can't I just eat more meat? No, really, you can't get enough into your diet because we're already at a disadvantage just based on our gender. So I found the first thing that happened when I started taking creatine last fall was that I was able to increase my weights at the gym. And for me, strength training is it's really important to understand that strength training helps maintain muscles, which maintains insulin sensitivity, which maintains metabolic flexibility. And you can't just do nothing. Like, you will lose muscle mass. That's why I see plenty of middle-aged women who are skinny fat. They're just skinny, and they don't have any muscle mass. And so it's really important to understand that complex in a relationship. So number one, I was able to lift heavier weights. And so I'm in menopause, so I'm at a biological disadvantage, because unless I'm taking bioidentical hormones, my body's not making the same amount of testosterone or estrogen or progesterone. It's just a byproduct of no longer being fertile. The other thing is I noticed is a lot of, cognitive improvement. So not that I was ever not sharp as a tack, but I do a lot of public speaking. I do a lot of podcasting. And so I have to be mentally sharp. And when I'm taking creatine, I just feel much more mentally clear. And I do that in addition to fasting. So that hasn't changed. But I do take creatine during my feeding window. I actually dissolve it in water very easily. My product, it effortlessly dissolves. I do a squeeze of lemon, and then I do some electrolytes. And that's kind of what I sip on during the day. And so that's worked out really well. But creatine is not something to be scared of. You're not going to suddenly make, Arnold Schwarzenegger circa 1987 muscles. That's not going to happen, but it's important for muscle and brain health. And I know for most women, especially perimenopausal, menopausal females, this is a really huge area of focus and concern.
So with yours, you just dissolve it in water. You add some lemon. Is that for the taste and the electrolytes you add too?
No,
Is
I
that
just I love lemon in my water. I'm kind of
okay?
a lemon
Just
aficionado. I mean, that's just something I do every day anyway,
okay.
but I consume it in my feeding window and
Okay.
it doesn't taste like anything. You could put it in a smoothie, you could put it in plain water. It has no taste, it doesn't clump. And that's one of the things I really appreciate is that it's literally just creatine monohydrate, which is the best researched supplement that's out there. And, if anyone knows Dr. Gabrielle Lyon, she's a huge proponent of creatine as well. And I got her blessing when I decided to go down that rabbit hole. I was like, okay, my first supplement with this company is going to be creatine. And so it's an easy thing to do. I travel with it. My teenagers take it and really like it. My husband takes it. And so it's applicable in particular for women because we're really at a biological disadvantage. And so we need more creatine. We can't get enough from our diet.
Okay. But it's something we can sip on through the day. It's not, you don't have to like drink it right away. I mean, I'm just trying to understand how it works. Cause I guess a friend of mine started taking it and she was like, I have to take it on an empty stomach. I have to hurry and it tastes awful. So that's why I'm trying to understand.
Yeah. I mean, I think she's probably using a product that has got fillers in. I prefer to just drink it down, but you can drink it throughout the day. I just like to monitor my water intake, especially when the heat goes on, because I tend to be, and today's a good example. I've done 4 hours of podcasting back to back. So for me, like I'm going to be playing catch up all evening because I get dehydrated from doing a lot of talking, not enough drinking because I don't want to have to run to the restroom while I'm recording. And so, yeah, I mean, to me, it's however you take it, however it makes the most sense for you. Like if it's easier for you to throw it in your water and drink it down, do that. If it's easier to throw it in a smoothie, do that, drink it down. If it's easier for you to sip on it, it's not going to hurt you, but you definitely want to take it during your feeding window.
Okay. Okay. One more question I have for you. And I think I heard you on one of your podcasts, I don't know, talking about this, but protein powders. We didn't talk about protein powders at all, but we have talked about how important protein is. And we didn't even go into how much protein, but how much protein should a woman in her 40s, 50s, 60s be trying to get?
I would say a minimum of 100 grams a day. And for people, like I did a story on Sunday morning showing people how I'd gotten in like 75 grams of protein, almost 80 in a meal. And I had 3 hard-boiled eggs at a restaurant. So that was 18. Then I had an 8-ounce steak. And that was 56 grams of protein. And I would say people overthink this. Like you could have 6 eggs, that's 36 grams of protein. So really it's 35 to 50 grams per meal to get close there. And if you track your macros, like Chronometer is a nice app. It's easy to use. They have a free option. I have no affiliation with them. You can track on Chronometer and you can figure out how many grams of protein am I eating. Now, I had my husband do this for a month because I was convinced he wasn't eating enough. But for a lot of people, they may do those 2 meals, but they're so full they can't eat more. And that's fine. You work your way up. For some people, they want to take a high quality like whey-based protein, and Marigold's a really nice option. And New Zealand whey, small batches, there's no crap in it. There's a lot of crappy protein powders that are out there. I'm dairy free, so I actually use a product from Designs for Health. That's a bone broth protein, but places like Paleo Valley have nice options that you can use as well. I'm not a huge plant-based protein powder person. I probably have tried them all in an effort to be objective. Food Babe has a product called Truvani, which is fairly clean, but I just think about, we don't know what pea-based protein really will do in the long term. And so I always try to say, if you tolerate dairy, do the whey. You don't tolerate dairy, do like a bone broth protein. I just find a lot of the plant-based protein sources like in a powder are clumpy and just not palatable.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Cynthia, thank you so much. Like I said before, I could sit and talk to you forever. And I know that if we were like next door neighbors or lived in the same city, we would be really good friends because we have so much of all the stuff, because I do love I know you like cryotherapy and red light and all that kind of stuff. And I do too. And I love to try to do everything that I can do to have longevity. I do want to be at a lower weight, but I mean, when I say a lower, like the weight that I'm at now, I want to maintain this weight. But I think more than a weight, it is for me. I want longevity and I want to
Mhm.
feel my best
Quality
at
of
this.
life.
Yeah, it really
Yeah. Well,
is.
you look amazing. So
Well,
you don't
thank
look
you.
like you
So do
have
you.
anything that you need to lose. But I would say the big
Yeah.
thing is quality of life. That's what
Yeah.
all of us should be focused on. I
Mhm.
had the fortune of being able to take care of patients for over 20 years. And there's nothing worse than seeing someone who's fairly young be so deconditioned and so debilitated that they can't have a good quality of life. And that's really why I enjoy the hacking piece. I like to figure things out. I'm actually interviewing a female biohacker tomorrow who's a physician. I can't wait to pick her brain about all the things. And so, yes, I would imagine if we lived in the same city, we'd be best buddies. And,
Yeah.
I know that we serve the same community of women. And I feel so very grateful that we've been able to be connected.
Me too. And thank you. Thank you so much for taking busy, busy times. I know you are super busy with all of your podcasting and all that you do and all the women that you help. And I just really appreciate you educating this audience more. And guys, if y'all are not listening to Cynthia's podcast, you really should be. She's got some of the greatest guests on there. I learn so much from you every single time I listen to your podcast. And now I've just started listening to this other one, Intermittent Fasting podcast with
Melanie Avalon.
Matt. Yeah. And how old is she? She's young though, right? Is she
She
younger?
is. She's 31. And so we laugh. We're like, we represent the needs of all women. That's what I told her. I said, this is fantastic. Because how many podcasts do you have like a 20-year age gap
Yeah.
between podcast hosts? So we're actually really good friends. And it's a really amazing community of men and women that listen to that podcast. So it's an awesome opportunity to connect with people.
That's awesome. Well, thanks again, Cynthia. I appreciate it.
Thank you. You're welcome.